Q&A was my impression. So,
All right.
but I don't know anything you want to wrap
No,
up?
I come to the last point.
Okay. Great. Okay. So, I'll try to stick to my time frame and we get to Q&A because I'm sure that's part of where people want to get engaged. So John Clark is my name. I've been a technology entrepreneur my entire life. This is definitely going to be from a startup or a small company perspective in terms of my perspective. My exposure to clean tech in the utility market was as the CEO of V2 Green, an early stage clean tech company that I was part of for a bit more than a year before it was acquired by Gridpoint about 3 years ago, which is a larger East Coast clean tech company. It's sort of funny, a good chunk of my career is, I think Daniela talked about in my bio, was in the wireless industry actually. And ironically, when I moved into clean tech and by joining V2 Green, there was this great founding team, 3 guys, Seth Bridges, Seth Pollock, and Dave Kaplan, who had started the company, had this great vision. They hadn't quite figured out exactly who was the customer going to be, who was going to buy this. And they got me excited about this, and I came on board to help with that project. And ironically, as we started digging into it of, okay, we had this great software that could do amazing things with electric vehicles and how they integrated with the grid, it slowly dawned on me that while I'd left telecom swearing I was never going to deal with a big lumbering organization again, that our target was electric utilities. So I traded telecom for a regulated monopoly. Sort of that said, there were several things I learned as we started engaging with utilities with our software that I think might help others as they're engaging in this effort. Like I said, this is coming from a startup perspective, but it is stuff that I learned as part of selling to IOUs like PG&E, Puget Sound Energy, SDG&E, Florida Power and Light, Xcel Energy, munis like Seattle City Light, Burbank Power and Water and Power, and co-ops like Prairie Power and Consumers Energies and other really small co-ops. This is certainly not intended to be a soup to nuts strategy, but more a set of things that occurred to me that might have been useful to know going into it. And some of this, for anybody that's already doing this, some of this is probably going to be duh. But for those that haven't embarked on it, it might be worth knowing. First, understand how utilities are classified. They're not all the same, and how they're regulated in their decision-making processes. IOUs, investor-owned utilities, which are the regulated ones that focus on can something be rate-based and how does that affect us, act and make decisions differently than a muni or a co-op. IOUs, their process, and you'll be able to talk to us a little bit about, and I honestly never completely got my head around it, but the decisions around trading OpEx or CapEx are not like a traditional business. If that's where you come from, you have to change your thinking. Munis and co-ops technically are more like a traditional business, but they're really focused on keeping their overall rates to their customers the lowest, and that is either customers equals voters in a muni environment, or customers equals owners in a co-op environment. But you just need to learn that environment to be able to talk to it and understand the motivations behind who it is you're talking to. Second, and this certainly affects small startup companies, trials. There's good and a bad about trials. The good is, in my experience, especially with cutting edge stuff, which is what we were in, utilities are often willing to do paid trials. So unlike telecom, where I was used to trials, but they made you go spend hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars of your own money and didn't pay you, at least utilities were willing to pay you something to go do this. So the good things about that, you can generate some revenue. You can start to deepen your relationship, and this, especially as a small company, when you don't have a big selling force, you can start to demonstrate that you can deliver on what you say. And those are all powerful things. What's the bad stuff about trials? It is easy to confuse the willingness for a utility to do a paid trial with some commitment to you or your technology. That's sort of, and even if you meet success criteria of the trial, it does not mean that that's going to then beget, you know, an even bigger project, because there are all sorts of things that are affecting that, and it's easy to convince yourself that, oh, if I have a trial, I'll just keep growing. And so it's also easy to get caught in the purgatory of sorts, where the trial is over, there's no more budget, you haven't committed to going forward, and so what Ethan talked about, and even if they do go forward, it's very likely that there's an RFP in your future. They're not just going to say, wow, we really like you, here's a much bigger contract. So I repeat, do not use traction of trials as some data point to project out how your business is going to grow. Ethan sort of touched on this, but the RF question mark. Is it RFP, RFQ, RFI, whatever. Do the procurement oversight, and I'd love to know actually how you get into the sole source stuff, because I certainly never figured that out. But usually the procurement oversight means that significant purchases by a utility are going to have to go through some sort of request for proposal, competitive bidding process. From my perspective, these comments that I'm about to give are not utility specific really. They're more RF, that RF process specific. Some bad news, just being close to key decision makers is not going to win you the business, in my experience. It's going to help. And the good news is you can use that relationship to learn a bunch of things and affect that process. But in any sort of request for proposal process where procurement gets involved, there is once it gets started, a pretty strong separation between the people that you've built relationships with and yourself. And so you need to make sure that you've done everything you can to lay the groundwork for success outside of that relationship. Ethan touched on this. If you didn't know about the RFP till you got it, you're in a lot of trouble. I can't speak from experience in another industry. It's not completely unrecoverable, but it's not a good thing if you're just responding to RFPs blind. That's not a good way to do it. Number two, in discussions with your target customers during a trial or even your discussions, you want to start thinking about, if they issue an RFP, what's that going to look like? What are going to be the questions that they're going to ask everybody? And what are going to be, more importantly, the questions that if they asked me and everybody else are going to make me look better? And the reason for that is that if there are things that differentiate you from the competition, you want to make sure that these are areas that are being tested, that are being talked about, that are going to be validated, and that are on their minds. Is it cost? Is it performance? Is it some ease of use? Whatever it is, you want to make sure that the people have that at the top of their minds as one of the key criteria that they want to be thinking about. From my perspective, this is a bunch of work, but it can be worth it. It is highly recommended that you put the effort into developing essentially your own RFP. This is what an RFP would look like for our product if somebody were to issue it to us. I would advise that be done in a sort of framework, genericized, where you've got the questions, all the hard questions that you don't really want to answer, but also the ones that you really want to answer, all together. And you would be surprised, in utilities, just like everywhere else, everybody has more things on their plate than they know what to do with. If offered in a way that isn't obviously biased toward your company, a generic framework about what an RFP might look like, you would be surprised how many pieces of that might show up in an RFP, almost unchanged. And it's human nature. If it's reasonable and it looks like a good series of questions and framework, and somebody else doesn't have to do the work, they may just take that and plop it right in. And I have seen that happen. And that can be a real advantage. The next step in that process, if you are sort of lucky enough to have that happen, do the work at starting to work on the answers before you get the RFP. RFPs are notorious for having really short time frames. And the last thing you want is to have totally knocked the ball out of the park by having them essentially use your RFP and then be scrambling like crazy to try to fill out the answers to the questions, even in the ones that are sort of focused on you and your competitive advantages. Again, this is experience talking here. If you've done that work, when asked, like I have been more than once, like what's a reasonable response period?